Welcome back to the Horror Shack. Tonight, we'll explore true horror stories for sleep that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now let's get comfy. Story 1. Bang Bang, Who's There? I've heard a lot of strange things in my life. Some that make you laugh, some that make you shake your head, and others that keep you awake at night, staring at the ceiling. This story is the kind that keeps you awake, though I wish I could forget it. It's about my brother Mike, and one night he swears he'll never forget. Mike's been a trucker for over 20 years, and if you ask him, he'll tell you he's seen just about everything the road has to offer. Drunk drivers, freak accidents, and more than a few nights where he was sure he was the only soul for miles. But this night, he doesn't even like to talk about it. He was hauling a load of steel to Newark, New Jersey. It was early February, cold enough that his breath fogged up the windshield if the defroster wasn't blasting. He'd left Ohio around lunchtime and planned to drive through the night. Said he liked it better that way. Fewer cars, no distractions, just him and the hum of the engine. He'd done this route 100 times before, but that night he said felt off. I asked him what he meant by off. He couldn't put his finger on it. It's like the silence was heavier, he said. You ever notice that? How some nights just feel wrong, like the air itself is pressing in on you. By the time he hit Pennsylvania, the highway was empty. Not unusual for that time of night. He figured it was around 3 a.m., but he noticed the woods seemed darker than usual. The moon was out, but it didn't seem to light up the road like it should have. He drove on for a while, the miles ticking by in the glow of his dashboard. Then his stomach growled, and he remembered he hadn't eaten since the gas station outside Pittsburgh. He spotted a rest area sign up ahead, one of those rundown ones with a couple of vending machines and nothing else. Normally, he'd skip places like that, but hunger won out. When he pulled in, he noticed two other trucks parked there. Both were idling, their taillights glowing faintly through the fog that clung to the ground. He thought about getting out to stretch, maybe see if the other drivers were awake, but something stopped him. Can't explain why. He told me later. I just had this feeling like I shouldn't. He killed the engine and sat there for a minute listening. The woods around him were completely silent. Not even the usual chirping of crickets or rustling leaves. Just the low rumble of those other trucks and his own breathing. Then came the first knock. It was faint, like someone tapping on glass with their fingernail. Mike froze, his hand halfway to the door handle. He figured it had to be a branch or something, a twig caught in the wind. But when he glanced at the passenger side window, there wasn't anything there. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it came from the driver's side. Mike turned so fast he almost pulled a muscle in his neck. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of pavement leading back to the highway. Maybe I'm tired, he thought, hearing things. But he wasn't the kind of guy to spook easy, and he wasn't about to let some noise mess with his head. He leaned forward, squinting into the rearview mirror. The other trucks were still there, engines idling, but he didn't see anyone moving around. No headlights coming or going. Just the fog thickening under the flickering light of the rest area sign. That's when the banging started. Loud, deliberate, and on both sides of the truck at once. The banging was so sudden, Mike jolted back against his seat. It wasn't like the tapping from before. This was loud, aggressive, like fists slamming against the sides of the truck. The kind of sound that makes your heart jump into your throat. It came from the driver's side, then the passengers, then both at the same time. Bang, bang, bang. 3 hard knocks, perfectly synchronized. Mike stared at the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Who the hell's out there? He muttered under his breath. He rolled the window down just a crack and shouted, "Hey, if this is some kind of joke, knock it off." Silence. He waited, listening for any kind of movement outside. Footsteps, rustling, even breathing. But all he could hear was the low hum of the other trucks in the distance and the faint buzz of the rest area light. His hand hovered over the door handle. Every instinct told him not to get out, but he was pissed now. If some kid was messing around, they'd picked the wrong guy to scare. Mike wasn't about to let someone get the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into the cold. The air hit him like a slap, icy and sharp, but the fog hung so thick around the truck that the light barely cut through it. He swept the beam around the parking lot, checking under the truck, behind the trailer, even up in the trees. Nothing. No footprints in the frost. No signs of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. That's when he noticed something strange. The other two trucks, still idling, their lights faint in the fog, weren't moving. No one was stepping out to check on the noise. No one was poking their head out to see what was going on. It was like the drivers didn't hear anything at all. Mike felt the first prickle of real unease. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Hey, you guys hear that? Someone's messing around out here." No response. He took a few cautious steps toward the closest truck, a big red Peterbilt with its engine rumbling steady. The driver's seat was empty. Mike leaned in closer, peering through the glass. The cab was dark, but he could make out a crumpled fast food bag on the dashboard and a jacket draped over the passenger seat. "Hello." He tried again, louder this time. He banged his fist against the door, hoping to wake whoever was inside. Still nothing. He moved to the second truck, a blue Kenworth parked about 20 feet away. Same deal, engine running, cab empty, no sign of the driver. The weird part? Both trucks had frost on the windshields, like they'd been sitting there for hours. But the engines were warm. Mike felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He turned back toward his own truck, the fog swallowing his steps. And then he heard it again. Bang, bang, bang. But this time it wasn't coming from his truck. It was coming from the woods. Mike froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound was deep, deliberate, and impossibly loud, like someone slamming a battering ram against a hollow tree. "Who's out there?" he shouted, his voice cracking in a way he'd never admit later. He swept the beam of his flashlight toward the tree lean, but the fog seemed to pull the light away, leaving nothing but shifting shadows. The banging stopped. For a second, the silence was almost worse. Mike stood there, his breath puffing out in short, frantic bursts. He thought about getting back in the truck, locking the doors, and just waiting until morning. But then he saw it. In the fog, just at the edge of the light, there was movement. It wasn't much, just a flicker of something, too quick to focus on. But it was enough to send every nerve in Mike's body screaming at him to run. And then it spoke. A voice, low and distorted, came from somewhere in the trees. "Why do you leave your truck, Mike?" He froze. His name, whoever or whatever was out there, knew his name. He backed away, his flashlight shaking so badly the beam danced across the ground. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "but you need to stay the hell away from me." The voice didn't answer. Instead, the banging started again, louder than ever, coming from all around him. It echoed through the fog, the trees, the trucks. It felt like it was coming from inside his own head. Mike turned and ran, bolting back to his truck. He scrambled up into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, he saw it. A handprint, smeared in condensation, appeared on the outside of the passenger window. It wasn't a normal handprint, though. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide, the shape just wrong. He didn't wait to see if it moved. He floored it, tearing out of the rest area and back onto the highway. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. For a few minutes, he drove in silence, the world outside his cab a blur of fog and shadows. He told himself it was over. Whatever it was, he'd left it behind. But then his CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static. Then, through the hiss and crackle, he heard the voice again. You left too soon, Mike. The radio went dead. Mike slammed his fist against the CB, trying to turn it off, but the switch wouldn't budge. The radio hissed back to life, static clawing at his ears. He reached for the volume dial, but before he could, the voice returned, closer now, clearer, as though someone was sitting in the cab with him. You shouldn't have run, it whispered, each word drawn out, almost mocking. Mike felt his skin crawl. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the sleeper behind him. The cab was empty. He was alone. Shut up, he yelled, his voice cracking. He grabbed the CB mic and yanked it from its mount, tossing it onto the passenger seat. For a moment, the cab was silent except for the hum of the engine. Then the headlights flickered. Mike tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the fog swallowing everything beyond the faint glow of his beams. He couldn't shake the feeling that the road looked wrong. The trees on either side seemed taller, their branches twisted like clawed fingers reaching toward the asphalt. And then he noticed the mile marker. It was the same one he'd passed 20 minutes ago. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. He tried to tell himself it was just fatigue, that he'd imagined it. But as the miles ticked by, the same sign appeared again. And again. Am I even going anywhere? He checked the clock on the dashboard. 3:47 a.m. It had been 3:47 a.m. the last 3 times he'd looked. The radio crackled again. This time it wasn't a voice. It was music. A scratchy, warped version of an old song Mike couldn't place. The notes bending and breaking like they were being played on a record left out in the sun. He slammed his fist against the dashboard. Stop it. Just stop. The music stopped. But the moment it did, the cab grew colder. Not just chilly, freezing, like someone had opened the door and let the winter air rush in. His breath fogged up in front of him, and frost began to creep across the inside of the windshield. Mike rubbed at the glass with his sleeve, trying to clear it, but as he did, something caught his eye. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the fog. At first, Mike thought it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a bear. But as the truck drew closer, he realized it was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, motionless, their face obscured by the fog. Mike slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. The truck lurched to a stop, the trailer swaying behind him. His heart pounded as he stared through the windshield. The figure was gone. He leaned forward, peering into the fog. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaky. "You okay?" No response. He reached for the flashlight again, his hands trembling. Part of him wanted to just hit the gas and get the hell out of there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just seen someone. What if they were hurt? He opened the door and stepped down onto the asphalt, the cold biting through his jacket. The flashlight beam wavered as he scanned the road ahead. Nothing, just the endless fog and the faint outline of the trees beyond it. Mike turned to get back in the truck and froze. There, on the side of the trailer, were claw marks. Deep, jagged gouges in the metal, like something had tried to tear its way inside. He stared at them, his breath hitching. Each mark was perfectly spaced, too deliberate to be random. He reached out and ran his fingers over the grooves. The metal felt cold and damp, as though the marks had just been made. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind him. Mike spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the fog. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the trees. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. He backed away, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the flashlight. He climbed back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The growling stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. Mike put the truck in gear, his foot slamming down on the accelerator. The engine roared as the truck barreled down the highway, the fog parting just enough to reveal the road ahead. But no matter how fast he drove, He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. Mike hesitated, glancing at it. The screen was blank. No missed call, no text, nothing. But the buzzing continued, a low, persistent hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire cab. And then the voice came back. "Why are you running, Mike?" He slammed the phone onto the floor, the screen shattering. The buzzing stopped. For a few minutes, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint rattle of the trailer behind him. Mike's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. And then he saw the headlights. Two bright beams, coming up fast in his rearview mirror. He squinted, trying to make out the vehicle, but the lights were blinding, almost unnatural. The truck shook as the vehicle closed the distance, its engine roaring. Mike tried to wave it off, flashing his hazards, but the lights only grew brighter. The vehicle was right on his bumper now, so close he could see the outline of the driver in the glow of the mirrors. But the outline wasn't, right? The head was too large, the shoulders too wide, the posture hunched like something that didn't belong behind the wheel. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the vehicle veered off into the trees, its headlights vanishing into the fog. Mike's heart was pounding, his breath coming in short gasps. He didn't stop driving until the first faint glow of dawn appeared on the horizon. When he finally pulled into a truck stop outside Newark, he noticed the claw marks on the trailer were gone. The frost on the windshield had melted, but as he stepped out of the cab, his radio crackled one last time. "You left too soon, Mike." And then silence. Mike stumbled into the truck stop diner, his legs trembling beneath him. The warm glow of the neon open sign felt like salvation, and the faint murmur of other truckers chatting over coffee was grounding. He needed people, witnesses, something real to break the hold of whatever the hell had just happened. Sliding into a booth near the window, he ordered black coffee from the waitress without looking up. His hands were still shaking as he fumbled for his phone, which was now cracked and useless. He tossed it onto the table in frustration and buried his face in his hands. "What's eating you, buddy?" a voice said. Mike glanced up to see a fellow trucker, a burly man with a thick beard and a baseball cap, standing next to his booth. Behind him, another driver with a wiry frame and tired eyes stood, nursing a mug of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the wiry one added, sliding into the booth across from Mike uninvited. The burly one sat beside him. Mike hesitated, unsure of how to even begin explaining what he'd just been through. "I don't even know, man," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Something happened out there. Something I can't explain." The two men exchanged glances, their expressions darkening. "Where were you driving?" the burly man asked, his tone suddenly serious. "Pennsylvania," Mike replied. "That stretch of highway through the woods near Route 83, the wiry one interrupted. Mike's blood ran cold. "Yeah, how did you?" The burly man leaned in, his voice low. "You're not the first. A few of us have had experiences on that road. Same time of night, same stretch of fog." Mike stared at them, his mind racing. "You've seen it too?" The wiry man nodded. "Not just seen it, heard it, felt it. Whatever's out there, it's real." For the first time all night, Mike felt a flicker of relief. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't alone. "But here's the thing," the burly man said, his voice dropping even lower. "It doesn't stop when you leave." Mike froze. "What do you mean?" The wiry man took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "It follows you. Maybe not right away, but it always does. It's like it marks you or something." Mike's stomach churned. "How do you know?" The burly man rolled up his sleeve, revealing deep, jagged scars on his forearm. Scars that looked eerily like the claw marks Mike had seen on his trailer. "Because it's still with me," he said. The room seemed to grow colder, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Mike glanced out the window, half expecting to see those piercing headlights or the twisted figure from the road. But the parking lot was empty, save for a few parked rigs. The waitress returned with his coffee, but her warm smile faltered when she saw the look on his face. "You okay, hon?" she asked. Mike nodded quickly, not wanting to draw any more attention. "Yeah, just tired." She lingered for a moment before leaving him to his thoughts. "What do I do?" Mike asked the two men, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I stop it?" The wiry man shook his head. "You don't. You just try to keep moving, keep ahead of it. But sooner or later, it catches up." Mike's heart sank. He couldn't live like that, constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next encounter. The burly man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "But there is one thing. Some people say it's drawn to fear. The more scared you are, the stronger it gets." Mike thought back to the voice on the CB, the headlights, the claw marks. He had been terrified, and it had only gotten worse. "Then I won't be afraid," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The two men exchanged a look, but said nothing. Mike got back in his truck after an hour at the diner, the coffee doing little to steady his nerves. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. The other drivers had left without another word, their rigs rumbling out of the parking lot and into the pre-dawn mist. As he pulled back onto the highway, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the fog. For a moment, Mike felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe the light would chase away whatever had been haunting him. But then he glanced at the dashboard clock. 3:47 a.m. His blood turned to ice. The clock hadn't changed, and then the radio crackled to life. "You left too soon," the voice said, its tone colder, harsher than before. Mike slammed his fist against the radio, yanking the wires loose, but the voice didn't stop. "You can't run from me, Mike. You belong to the road now." The truck lurched as the engine sputtered, the headlights dimming. Mike gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, as the fog thickened around him, swallowing the road entirely. And then he saw it, the figure. It was standing in the middle of the road again, but this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy shapes emerged from the fog, their forms twisting and flickering like static on an old TV. Mike's instinct screamed at him to hit the brakes, but his foot stayed frozen on the accelerator. The truck barreled toward the figures, the fog closing in tighter and tighter until everything went black. When Mike woke up, he was slumped over the wheel, the truck parked neatly in a rest area. The sun was shining, the fog gone. He stumbled out of the cab, blinking against the bright light. His truck was pristine, no claw marks, no frost, no sign of the nightmare he'd just endured. But as he turned to head inside the rest area, he froze. There, etched into the dirt beside his truck, were the same claw marks he'd seen before. And beneath them, scrawled in jagged letters, were 3 words. "See you soon." Mike never drove that route again. But late at night, when the fog rolls in and the clock reads 3:47 a.m., he still hears the voice in his dreams. "You left too soon." Story 2. The Gentleman in Black. I never believed in things like ghosts or the supernatural. I'm not one of those people who jumps at every little noise or assumes the worst when something goes wrong. I always chalk things up to coincidence, the mind playing tricks, or just a bad string of luck. But what happened to my boyfriend, Kyle, changed all of that. It's a story I'm not sure I can fully explain, and after hearing it, I don't think you'll be able to either. I guess it's worth starting by saying that Kyle is a truck driver. He's been doing it for years, long shifts, late nights, the usual grind. He's the kind of guy who can drive for hours without even blinking, and he's used to being on the road at all hours of the night. This particular night, though, something strange happened. And I don't mean something strange like, oh, a tire blew out or he got lost in the fog. No, this was something that still doesn't make sense, no matter how many times I've asked him about it. It started with a truck stop, a place he had stopped at countless times before, but this time it felt different. The kind of different that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He'd been on the road for hours, and when he saw the sign for the stop, he was relieved. He was exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open. The idea of parking and getting some sleep for a few hours seemed like a godsend. But there was something off about this particular stop. The lot was nearly empty, just a couple of trucks scattered around. The usual buzzing neon lights were absent, and the place felt unusually quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels suffocating, like the world around you is holding its breath. There was a lone flickering light near the entrance, casting an eerie glow over the trucks parked in a circle. Kyle didn't think much of it at first. He was tired, and his body was screaming for rest. He pulled into a space toward the back of the lot, far away from the other trucks. The engine cut off with a quiet sigh, and for a moment, it was just him, the truck, and the endless stretch of dark highway in front of him. He was parked right next to some woods that seemed to stretch on forever. Not a single sound came from the trees. Not a rustle, not a chirp, not even the wind moving through them. Kyle set up in the camper in the back of his rig, settled in for the night, and tried to get some sleep. It wasn't long before his eyes closed, and the world around him slipped away. The next thing he remembers, it's morning, bright and crisp, but somehow off. Kyle woke up with the sun already high in the sky, his body stiff from a night spent in the driver's seat. He rubbed his eyes, disoriented, and glanced around. Something didn't seem right. The truck wasn't parked where he thought it should be. It wasn't parked in the lot anymore. Instead, it was on the side of the highway, at least 15 miles away from the truck stop. He froze. He knew he hadn't driven. He knew he'd been asleep the entire time. So how did his truck end up here? How could he have gone that far without even remembering a single moment of it? His heart started pounding as his mind raced through the possibilities. He thought maybe someone had stolen his truck, but that didn't make sense. The doors had been locked from the inside. The keys were right where he had left them. He was sure of it. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of forced entry. It didn't add up. As he sat there, trying to piece together what had happened, 3 highway patrol cars pulled up behind him. The officers didn't ask questions at first. They just told him to step out of the truck. They had a report about a suspicious vehicle. They said they'd found him here, abandoned, with the truck in the middle of nowhere. Kyle tried to explain that he'd been parked at a truck stop, but the officers didn't seem to believe him. Then came the strangest part of the whole ordeal. The officers told him they had seen a man running from his truck, an unshaven figure in a black jumpsuit. The man had disappeared into the nearby woods, and when they searched, they didn't find a trace of him. Just a truck sitting there with Kyle inside it. No one had broken into it. No one had tried to steal it. Still, Kyle felt uneasy. More than uneasy, he felt watched. The entire time the officers were there, something in the air felt off, like something was pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. What happened next left him shaken. As he left the scene and made his way to his next stop, something followed him. At first, it was subtle, a feeling of being watched, like someone was right behind him, but when he checked, nothing was there. Over time, it became more intense. Kyle began to notice things out of place. His truck's interior started to feel different. Items he knew he'd left in one spot were now missing. His jacket, his keys, his favorite pair of sunglasses, they all vanished without explanation. And then there were the dreams. Dreams of that same black-clad figure standing just outside his truck, staring in, unmoving. Sometimes the figure was closer, sometimes farther away, but always there, watching him. It didn't take long before Kyle started to change. He became more paranoid, more irritable. I noticed it too. The guy I loved wasn't the same. He was jumpy, always looking over his shoulder like he expected someone, or something, to be there. Then one night, as he was driving alone, he saw it. A figure, clad in black, standing by the side of the road. The same man, just like the officer had described. And he was staring right at him. Kyle floored the gas pedal and didn't look back. That's when it hit him. He wasn't being paranoid. The man in black wasn't just a hallucination or a memory of some bad dream. The figure had been following him ever since that night at the truck stop. After that night, Kyle became even more distant. He didn't talk about it much, but I could tell he was afraid. He was haunted by something he couldn't shake. And no matter how much he tried to explain it, no one believed him. Not his friends, not his family, and definitely not the police. So, I ask you, what was it that followed him? Was it the ghost of someone who died on that stretch of highway? Or was it something darker, something that waited at that truck stop just for him? I don't know the answer, but I do know this. Kyle hasn't been the same since. And sometimes, when he's driving late at night, he calls me, his voice shaking. I think he's still out there, he says. The gentleman in black. I think he's been with me this whole time. Kyle didn't talk about it for a while. In fact, it was weeks before he finally opened up to me again. I kept waiting for him to tell me the truth. What happened that night, what he'd seen, why he couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. But every time I tried to ask, he would change the subject. It was like he was scared that even talking about it would make it real. I could see the toll it was taking on him, though. His eyes were always a little too wide, like he was waiting for someone to jump out at him. His hands would shake when he grabbed his keys or his coffee cup. He'd get up in the middle of the night, sometimes in a cold sweat, as though he'd heard a knock on the door or someone whispering his name. But when I'd ask, he would just brush it off, saying it was nothing, that he was just tired from the road. It all came to a head one night. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the sound of Kyle's truck pulling into the driveway. He'd been gone for almost 3 days, and I was relieved to hear him back. But then, just as quickly as the relief came, something else followed. I don't know how to explain it, but the air around me felt thicker, like there was more weight to the world. The house felt colder, and I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling of dread. It was like something bad was about to happen, something I couldn't stop. When Kyle came through the door, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the floor, breathing heavily. I could tell something was wrong, really wrong. He wasn't just tired from the long drive. Something had happened, something that terrified him. I rushed over to him, and he pulled me into his arms, but his body was trembling like a leaf in the wind. I saw him again, Kyle whispered, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't used it in days. The man in black. He's been following me, watching me. I don't know what to do. At first, I thought he was just overtired, imagining things. But the more I looked at him, the more I realized he wasn't joking. He wasn't acting like someone who'd had too much coffee or was simply exhausted. This was different. The way his hands were shaking, the fear in his eyes, it was real. I sat him down and tried to get the details out of him. I needed to know what was going on, what he was seeing. He told me that after the last time he'd seen the figure on the side of the road, it had been following him for days, watching from the trees, appearing in the rearview mirror when he least expected it, standing just out of the corner of his eye. He had even stopped at another truck stop, hoping to find some peace, but the moment he parked his truck, he felt that same dread creeping back. He said the figure had been getting closer. Every night it was standing farther along the road, closer to his truck, closer to him. Every time he looked in his mirror, it was there waiting. That night, though, something was different. As he was driving down a long stretch of highway, trying to get through the night, Kyle felt the familiar weight in the air again. He was on the lookout, his eyes darting to every shadow along the roadside. He knew that feeling by now. It was coming. But this time, he couldn't shake it off. It was like something was wrong with his truck. His brakes started to screech, and the truck jerked forward, as if something was pulling it. Kyle slammed his foot down on the pedal, trying to regain control, but the wheel spun out of his hands, as if someone else was gripping it. That's when he saw it, a figure in black, standing in the middle of the road, blocking his path. The lights of his truck caught the figure's face, but it wasn't a face. It was just a shadow, a dark, featureless thing. Kyle said it moved toward him, slowly at first, but then it started to glide. Not walk, glide. And the closer it came, the more his truck seemed to struggle. The steering wheel refused to turn, the gears locked up, and it was like the truck was being pulled toward the figure. But Kyle managed to get control back. He swerved at the last second, narrowly missing the thing, and when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw it again, standing on the side of the road, just watching him. When he finally made it back home that night, he had no idea how he'd managed to get there. The truck was fine, but his mind? His mind was shattered. I tried to comfort him as best as I could, but nothing seemed to help. That was when Kyle started to really change. He wouldn't talk to anyone. He didn't want to leave the house. He'd get up in the middle of the night, pacing the floors like he was listening for something. His paranoia was getting worse, and I could feel it too, like something was always just behind me, lurking, watching. It wasn't just Kyle anymore. I started to feel it too, and then one night I saw it. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of the front door creaking open. Kyle had fallen asleep on the couch, and I assumed it was just him getting up to get a glass of water or something. But when I peeked out into the hallway, I saw the door wide open, darkness spilling through the crack. I swear I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't move. The footsteps grew louder, and then I heard a voice I didn't recognize. It was soft, almost soothing, but also chilling. It whispered, "He's not alone anymore." I slammed the door shut, locked it, and ran to Kyle. I shook him awake, but when he opened his eyes, they weren't the same. They were hollow, like he wasn't there anymore. "I told you," he whispered, his voice distant. "He's still here. He never left." That's when I saw it. Behind him, in the reflection of the glass door, the shadowy figure of the man in black, standing in the doorway, just watching us. And in that moment, I realized that whatever Kyle had encountered, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It wasn't something that could be explained away. The man in black had followed him home, and it wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. It was as if it had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The room grew colder. The air grew thicker, and the footsteps, they came closer. Now every night when I sleep, I hear them, slow, measured steps, always in the distance, always getting closer. And every time Kyle gets behind the wheel, I wonder if he's really alone out there on the road. I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for him. The days after that night felt like a fog, an endless blur where nothing seemed real. Kyle didn't talk much. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with images of that man in black, standing just outside the truck, or appearing in his rearview mirror with that eerie, hollow gaze. But I couldn't escape it either. There were nights I'd wake up to the feeling of eyes on me, the weight of someone's gaze, but when I'd look, there would be no one there. It was becoming harder to tell where the nightmares ended and reality began. Every time I walked into the living room, I'd glance toward the door, half expecting to see that dark figure standing just beyond the threshold. Sometimes I'd hear the faintest scratch, like something or someone was trying to claw its way inside. Kyle's paranoia escalated. He wouldn't leave the house for long periods. He would sit by the window, staring out at the dark, his eyes darting around like he was waiting for something to happen. The lights would flicker, sometimes even when there was no storm. The doorbell would ring at odd hours, but when I answered, no one was there. I started to wonder if it wasn't just Kyle who was being affected. The breaking point came on a cold, crisp evening. Kyle had been out for a drive. He'd left earlier than usual, almost like he was escaping, as if he needed to put distance between himself and whatever haunted him. It was a Saturday night, and I was sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a book, when I heard the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. It was late, almost 2 a.m., and the sound of his engine felt different tonight. More distant, like it wasn't coming from the driveway at all. I looked out the window, but the truck was nowhere in sight. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed outside, hoping he was just pulling around the back, but there was no sign of him. The driveway was empty, and yet I could still hear the sound of the truck idling. That low rumble reverberated through the ground, making my chest tighten. It sounded so close, yet I couldn't see it. I ran back inside, grabbed my coat, and bolted out the front door again, this time turning to the side of the house. There, at the edge of the woods, the truck sat idling, headlights glowing faintly through the fog. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. I approached the truck cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. As I drew closer, I saw him. Kyle was slumped over in the driver's seat, eyes closed. He wasn't moving, and at first I thought he was just asleep. But as I reached the door, I noticed something else. The truck's interior was wrong. The seats, the dashboard, it looked like someone had been inside, but not Kyle. The air was heavy with a strange, metallic scent, like rust and old oil. And then I saw it. On the passenger seat, a long, dark coat. A coat I knew I hadn't seen before. It was too long, too dark, and it looked wrong. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the door, shaking Kyle awake, but he didn't respond. He was cold, unnaturally cold, and his skin was almost ashen. His eyes flickered open slowly, but they weren't his eyes. They were hollow, distant, empty. Kyle, Kyle. I shook him harder, but his gaze never met mine. Then, without warning, he turned his head sharply to the side, staring straight ahead into the woods. His lips parted, but it wasn't him speaking. The voice that came from his mouth was hoarse, a gravelly whisper that made my skin crawl. "He's waiting for you." I froze. The voice wasn't Kyle's. It was deep, so deep, it vibrated in my bones. "Oh," I whispered, my voice trembling. "The gentleman in black." His words came out slow and deliberate, each syllable heavy with a weight I couldn't understand. I took a step back, my mind reeling, but then I heard something. Footsteps, slow, measured, like someone was approaching. I turned, instinctively looking toward the woods, and there he was, the man in black, standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the reach of the headlights. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his presence was enough. I could feel it, feel him, like the air itself had thickened around me. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, waiting, and then, without warning, Kyle's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. His fingers dug into my skin, and the coldness of his touch sent shockwaves of terror through me. His eyes snapped back to me, but they were empty, like he wasn't even there anymore. "He's waiting for you," Kyle repeated, his voice now a low growl. I wrenched myself free, stumbling backward. My breath was ragged, my pulse deafening in my ears. The man in black took a single step forward, and that was all it took. The moment he moved, the world around me seemed to shift. The air grew still. The trees grew silent. It felt like time itself was holding its breath. I turned and ran. I didn't care about Kyle. I didn't care about the truck. I didn't care about anything. I ran, and I didn't stop. I ran through the woods, through the dense fog, until I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my feet against the ground. But even as I ran, I could feel it. I could feel him, the man in black, right behind me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled into something hard. I fell, my hands scraping against the earth as I hit the ground. I pushed myself up and looked, but there was nothing there. No figure, no man in black. I was alone, or so I thought. That's when I felt it again, the coldness. That same coldness that had seeped into Kyle's touch, the one I couldn't shake. I looked over my shoulder, and there he was, the man in black, standing just at the edge of the woods, staring at me. But this time his face was clear. There were no eyes, just darkness, and then nothing. I woke up on the side of the road, alone. The morning sun was breaking through the fog, casting an eerie glow over the highway. There were no patrol cars, no truck, just an empty stretch of asphalt stretching out before me. Kyle's truck was gone. I haven't seen Kyle since that night. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he's still out there, running, hiding from whatever took him. But I know one thing for sure. The man in black, he never leaves, and I think he's waiting for me. Story 3. Encounter in northern Manitoba. There are roads out there that don't belong to anyone, places that seem to belong to something else. I've driven long enough to know the difference between a normal stretch of highway and one that feels like it's part of the land itself. Up in northern Manitoba, you'll find plenty of those roads, tucked away from the world and winding through the heart of the forest. It's one of the reasons I love driving truck out there. The quiet, the solitude, it had its own kind of peace. But I'll tell you something. Peace can feel a lot different when you're not alone, even if you can't see the other presence. The roads up north don't just take you from one place to another. They make you feel like you're crossing some invisible line. You can't explain it, but it's there, and it's enough to make you question what's really out there. I'll never forget the first time I saw it. It was a cold night in late October, when the forest is beginning to look like something out of a dream. The trees are bare, their limbs twisting into the sky like skeletal fingers. I was driving along Highway 39, one of the lonelier routes I've taken. There's a stretch of it that runs for miles without so much as a gas station or a house in sight. No other vehicles either, just me and the road, sometimes for hours. That night, I was making a delivery to a small mining site further up north, and I had just finished a long stretch of road when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights, maybe a moose or something tall like that. But this figure, didn't move the way animals do. It was still for a moment, standing in the middle of the road, so tall I could barely make out its outline in the dark. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It stood upright, more like a person than an animal, but the shape didn't seem quite human. It was too large, too long, and its movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if it were watching me. I kept my eyes on it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I should have kept driving, but I slowed down, staring at the figure through my windshield. I felt a lump form in my throat, the kind you get when you know you've seen something that doesn't belong. My heart started racing, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then it was gone, just like that. It vanished into the trees without a sound. I didn't stop. I didn't want to stop. My hands were gripping the wheels so tight, I thought my fingers might break off. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had just seen wasn't supposed to be out there. Later, when I made my stop at the mining site, I tried to shake it off. But it wasn't long before I heard other drivers talking about it on the radio. It was a tow truck driver, out of Churchill. He was describing a sighting exactly like mine, right down to the details. He said he saw a tall, shadowy figure standing in the road, just like it had been waiting for him. He didn't seem embarrassed. He didn't laugh it off. No, he was dead serious. He kept saying he knew it wasn't just his mind playing tricks. He didn't want anyone to think he was crazy. And yet, the way he described it, I knew exactly what he meant. I wasn't the only one who'd seen something strange. You might be wondering, like I did, if this could just be a coincidence. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was some weird shadow caused by the trees. But there was something about the way the tow truck driver spoke about it, his voice shaking, his tone serious, that made me believe it wasn't just some coincidence. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't the only one who'd had this encounter. I tried to push it to the back of my mind. It was a long drive, and I had work to do. But then, days later, I ran into a guy I knew from a nearby indigenous community. His name was Liam, and he was an elder. We were sitting at a small diner, and I don't know why, but I felt the urge to ask him if he had ever heard of anything like that happening on those roads. At first, he was quiet. He didn't say much, but when I mentioned the sightings, his eyes narrowed, and for a second, he seemed to be thinking about something far away. Finally, he told me something that stuck with me. He said, "The elders speak of things in those woods, things that watch. They aren't like you or me." I didn't quite understand what he meant at the time, but he wasn't joking. I could tell by the way his voice dropped when he said it. He looked at me and said, "It's not something that goes away. It waits, it watches, and it never forgets." I wasn't sure if I should take him seriously. Maybe it was just a story. But then the sightings started happening more often. The same figure, on the same roads. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I heard about it from other truckers, too. A friend of mine, an old-timer named Doug, told me he saw something like it too, but he didn't want to talk about it in detail. All he said was, "Whatever it is, it doesn't mean you any good." I couldn't get those words out of my head. It was like the more I learned, the more questions I had, and the more questions I had, the more I realized how little I knew about what was out there. One night I decided to go back. I couldn't shake the need to find out what this thing was. Maybe it was just my curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something deeper inside me that pushed me to go back. I packed a flashlight and drove out to that same stretch of road, determined to find out what was hiding in the trees. When I reached the spot where I saw it, where it had disappeared into the brush, I pulled over and turned off the engine. The forest was so quiet, it felt like everything was holding its breath. The only sound was the wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the branches, and the distant chirping of crickets. I got out of the truck and started walking toward the woods. The cold air hit my face, and I felt the goosebumps rising on my arms. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped into the forest, shining my flashlight across the underbrush. I could hear faint sounds, whispers almost, but they didn't seem to come from any one direction. It was like they were all around me. The flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, tapping it in frustration. But then, as the light steadied, I saw something, just ahead of me, something big, towering between the trees. At first, I thought it was a tree, but the shape didn't make sense. It was too tall, too thick, and then I saw it, the eyes, glowing in the dark. That's when everything went wrong. I froze. My breath caught in my chest, and my flashlight trembled in my hand. I couldn't tear my eyes away from those glowing eyes. They weren't the reflective shine of an animal's eyes. They were far too intense, far too unnatural. I swallowed hard, but the lump in my throat refused to go down. For a few seconds, I just stood there, locked in place, staring into the darkness where those eyes were. They didn't blink, they didn't move, but there was something in them, something alive, that made my skin crawl. Something that knew I was there, watching, and wasn't at all bothered by my presence. It felt like those eyes were studying me, measuring me, deciding whether I was a threat or something else. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It was so fast, I barely had time to process it before the thing shot across my field of vision, its massive shadow leaping across the forest floor in a way that no animal could. It was like the creature had no limit to its size, its speed, its strength. For a second, the only thing I could hear was my own heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I should have run. I should have gotten back to the truck, locked the doors, and driven away, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, a mix of fear and fascination holding me still. The whispers I had been hearing before seemed to grow louder, closer, like voices coming from all directions. I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the sound, but I couldn't. It was just gibberish. Then I realized with a sickening feeling that it wasn't in my head. It was coming from the woods, from the shadows. My eyes darted around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was no sign of the creature. It had vanished. The oppressive silence settled back in, but this time it was different. It was thick, suffocating, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I turned back toward my truck, my legs shaky beneath me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was there, watching me. Just as I started to take a step back, a sudden crack of a branch snapped behind me. My heart jumped into my throat, and I spun around, the flashlight flashing wildly. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the trees, the underbrush, the cold, silent darkness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. No, not a shadow. Something else entirely, sliding between the trees. It was tall, taller than anything I'd ever seen, and its movements were fluid, unnatural. There was no mistaking it this time. It was the creature I had seen before, but now I could see it clearly, a hulking, towering figure that seemed to bend the very trees around it as it moved. I couldn't tell what it was made of. The way it blended into the night was almost mesmerizing. And then it stopped. It stood there, perfectly still, staring at me with those same glowing eyes. This time, they were closer, much closer. I could feel the weight of them pressing against me, like the creature was in my head, staring right into my thoughts. The whispers became more distinct now, like voices, but they were speaking in a language I didn't understand. The sound was like the rustle of leaves, but the cadence was wrong. Too rhythmic, too intentional. My legs wouldn't move. I wanted to run. I knew I should have run, but I couldn't make myself. I had to know. Something told me I needed to know. So I did the worst thing I could have done. I took a step closer. The moment I did, the creature lunged. It moved so fast I couldn't even process it before it was nearly on top of me. I heard its footsteps, heavy, unnatural, but it was the sound of the air moving that was most terrifying, like something massive, alive, crashing through the world around me. I turned and ran without thinking. My breath came in gasps, my legs already on fire from the sudden sprint. I could feel the ground shaking beneath me, feel the weight of the creature behind me, closing the distance. It was like I was being hunted. I don't know how I made it back to the truck, but somehow I did. I reached the door, yanked it open, and slammed it shut behind me with all my strength. I locked the door as quickly as my trembling hands would allow. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't even want to turn the key in the ignition. I was sure that if I did, the thing would be standing right there, watching me, waiting. I had no idea how long I sat there in the truck, too terrified to move. All I could do was stare out into the darkness through the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of those glowing eyes. But there was nothing. The forest had swallowed the creature whole, and I was left in the silence. The stillness felt wrong, too wrong. It wasn't until hours later, after I finally got the nerve to start the engine and leave that stretch of road behind me, that I realized how much I had just seen. The creature didn't follow me. It didn't have to. It had me. It knew I would leave. I knew it too. Something deep inside me told me that I had just narrowly escaped something that had been watching this land for centuries. I wasn't just another trucker passing through. To it, I was something else, something to remember. It's been months since that night, but I still think about it every single day. I can't shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting, watching. The locals might call it a guardian of the land, but I don't think it cares about guarding anything. I think it's just waiting for something, waiting for the next person to stumble into its territory just like I did. I never went back to that road. I never even drove through the northern parts of Manitoba again. I couldn't. There's a part of me that feels like I made a mistake, like I shouldn't have run. I should have stayed. But then I think about those glowing eyes, those whispers, the way it moved through the forest, and I know deep down that I did the only thing I could do to survive. If you ever drive up north, maybe you'll find that stretch of road. Maybe you'll see it too. But I'll tell you right now, don't stop. Don't go looking for it. Because whatever that thing is, it's not something you want to meet face to face. It's not something you want to remember. And it's definitely not something you want to be watched by. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.